He called her a ghetto judge and kicked her in the stomach, right there in open court. But Detective Ryan Crawford didn't know the woman he tried to break had already gathered the evidence to destroy his entire world. And when the truth came out, his badge couldn't save him from what was coming next. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The morning sun barely warmed the tall windows of courtroom 7, but Judge Diane Mitchell was already wide awake. Her chambers were silent except for the faint scratch of her pen against legal pads, notes covering her desk like battle plans. In front of her sat a single case file, thicker than it should have been for a simple juvenile matter. The name at the top, Keshiah Williams, age 15, and beneath the arrest summary, the familiar signature chilled her blood. Detective Ryan Crawford. The charges read like a cruel joke, disorderly conduct, and threatening a peace officer. But Judge Mitchell had learned years ago that charges like those could mean anything or nothing at all when the accused was a young black girl. The words aggressive posture and capacious praises she had seen in far too many of Crawford's reports. The file painted Kesha as a threat, but the letters from her teachers, the honor roll certificates, and the glowing community recommendations in the supporting documents told a different story. Judge Mitchell sat back, rubbing her temples as the pieces connected. She had been watching Crawford for months, slowly piecing together the patterns in his arrests. Teenagers pulled from bus stops, from sidewalks, from library steps, always the same demographics, always the same neighborhoods, and always the same vague allegations. She had filed the discrepancies away, waiting for the day she could confront him without risking the investigation. But this case felt different. This time the victim was a child who reminded her of herself at 15. Quiet, smart, careful not to draw attention. And this time, Mitchell wasn't going to sit silently while another black child's future was shattered by false narratives and unchecked authority. She stood, smoothing her black judicial robes with steady hands. Today, Crawford would step into her courtroom thinking it was business as usual. He had no idea what was waiting for him. She would question him, expose the cracks in his carefully rehearsed facade, and start peeling back the layers of his lies in front of witnesses who could no longer look away. And as she gathered the case files and turned toward the door, Judge Mitchell felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had spent a career being underestimated by men like Ryan Crawford, but today that underestimation would become his undoing. Downstairs in the public waiting area, Kesha Williams sat beside her mother on a cold wooden bench, her back perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap, as if still in her school's honor assembly. Her dark blue school uniform was pressed and neat, a quiet rebellion against the ugliness she had already faced this week. But no amount of pressed seams or perfect posture could erase the ache in her stomach. The ache of knowing that no matter how perfect she appeared, some people only saw a problem to be removed. Angela Williams sat close, one arm wrapped around her daughter's shoulders, the other clutching a worn folder filled with certificates, teacher recommendations, and letters from community leaders. Angela had brought them all, as if proof of Keshma's goodness could somehow shield her from what was waiting inside that courtroom. But deep down, Angela knew that the truth wasn't always enough. Not when the man on the witness stand carried a badge and wore a uniform that too many people refused to question. Angela leaned over and whispered softly, her voice trembling beneath the weight of every injustice she had seen, but never spoken aloud. "Baby, just answer politely. Don't argue. Keep your eyes down. We'll get through this. You hear me?" Kesha nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had done everything right, walked home from school, waited for the bus, minded her business, and still she had ended up in handcuffs because a man in a dark blue uniform decided her existence was hostile. But today, as scared as she wasn't going to shrink. Not entirely. Somewhere deep inside, she knew what happened wasn't her fault. The courtroom doors creaked open, and the hallway filled with the clatter of shoes and the murmurs of people filing in. Defense attorneys adjusted their ties. Prosecutors shuffled papers with detached efficiency. A few community advocates sat in the gallery, hoping to bear witness to whatever unfolded next. But no one, not even Angela, knew how much would unravel before the morning ended. Angela smoothed Kesha's hair and gave her hand one last squeeze. "Let's go, sweetheart. Head up. Sugar straight. No one gets to decide who you are but you." Together they rose and entered the courtroom. The weight of the room pressed down on them immediately. At the front of the room sat the judge's bench, looming and distant. And to the side, just beyond the witness stand, stood an empty chair waiting for the man who had turned their lives upside down. Kesha sat quietly at the defendant's table, folding her hands once more. She didn't speak, she didn't argue, but she didn't shrink either. And behind the courtroom doors, footsteps echoed like approaching thunder. Detective Ryan Crawford was on his way. The heavy oak doors swung open with a jarring thud, breaking the uneasy silence that had settled over courtroom 7A, and there he was. Detective Ryan Crawford, all 6 feet 2 inches of him, filled the doorway with the kind of presence that didn't just demand attention, it forced it. His navy blue uniform, pressed sharp as a razor blade, gleamed beneath the courtroom lights. His duty belt rested comfortably on his hips, a silent declaration of power. Every step he took across the polished floor echoed like a warning shot. He didn't glance at the gallery. He didn't acknowledge the quiet stir of unease his arrival caused. His pale gray eyes swept the room with the cold precision of a predator surveying familiar terrain. And when those eyes landed on Kesha Williams, sitting so small and still at the defense table, a faint smirk curled at the corner of his mouth, as if to say, "Another one, another statistic." But then his gaze shifted upward, toward the bench, and for a split second something flickered across his face. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was recognition. The kind of recognition that told him Judge Diane Mitchell wasn't someone he could dismiss as easily as the others. Still, he squared his shoulders and continued his march forward, convinced that no one in this courtroom could truly challenge him. Not a teenager, not a mother, and certainly not a black woman in a robe. Judge Mitchell watched him approach with the same quiet intensity she had used to dismantle countless witnesses before him. She knew his type, men who wore their arrogance like armor, men who thought their badge made them untouchable, men who believed they could walk into any room and control the narrative before anyone else had a chance to speak. But Crawford didn't know what she knew. He didn't know about the files spread across her chambers late at night. He didn't know about the whistleblowers who had finally broken their silence. He didn't know that, for months, she had been quietly stitching together a case strong enough to tear down the walls he'd built around himself. To him, this was just another morning in court, another case to dismiss, another child to criminalize and discard. As Crawford took his seat at the witness stand, his posture spoke volumes, leaning back just enough to show his comfort, hands resting loosely on the chair's arms. His entire body language screamed of a man who believed the outcome was already written in his favor. But the silence in courtroom 7A felt different today. It wasn't the silence of submission. It was the silence of storm clouds gathering. Judge Mitchell picked up her pen, tapped it once against the legal pad before her, and met Crawford's eyes with unwavering resolve. This would not be his courtroom for long. And though Crawford smiled, unaware of the trap already closing around him, the cracks in his empire had already begun to form. What neither he nor anyone else knew was that this seemingly ordinary hearing was about to become the first domino in the collapse of his entire corrupt world. By the time the sun set, Ryan Crawford's name would no longer command fear. It would symbolize his fall. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Judge Mitchell adjusted her glasses and glanced at the witness stand. Crawford sat back in his chair like a man holding court, his arms draped lazily over the sides, his voice already dripping with smug confidence before she asked the first question. He thought this would be easy, Another judge, another kid, another day of patting himself on the back for keeping the streets safe. But Judge Mitchell wasn't playing his game. "Detective Crawford," she began, her voice steady and cool, "please describe for the court the events that led to the arrest of Ms. Keshniz." Crawford smiled, leaning forward slightly, as if explaining something to a child. "Your Honor, I was conducting a routine community wellness check in the East Side District when I observed a group of juveniles congregating near the Metro bus stop at 5th and Henderson." A few heads in the gallery turned at the phrase, "community wellness check." Everyone knew what that really meant: harassment, profiling. But Crawford said it like it was public service. "And how many juveniles were in this group?" Mitchell asked, her pen poised but not yet writing. "5, Crawford replied smoothly. 4 males and 1 female, all appearing to be between 14 and 17 years of age. Given recent reports of criminal activity in the area, I approached the group to assess the situation." Mitchell tilted her head slightly, a faint sign of skepticism. "And did you find any evidence of criminal activity among the group members?" Crawford's smile didn't waver. "No drugs, weapons, or contraband were found, Your Honor. However, Ms. Williams displayed behaviors consistent with escalating aggression. For the safety of the community and herself, I made the decision to detain her." Mitchell let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "And what specific behaviors indicated escalating aggression?" The pause that followed was small but significant. Crawford shifted in his chair, prolonged eye contact, confrontational posture, and refusal to comply with my verbal commands. A rustle swept through the courtroom gallery. Angela Williams' hand tightened around the folder in her lap. Kesha sat still, her face blank, but her eyes burning. Mitchell jotted down a brief note, then looked back up. "So to be clear, Detective Crawford, Miss Williams was arrested for maintaining eye contact and standing still?" Crawford's jaw flexed. "In my professional experience, those are precursor behaviors to potential threats. Officers are trained to de-escalate before violence occurs." "Did Miss Williams attempt to strike you, curse at you, threaten you verbally or physically?" "No, Your Honor, but her demeanor was defiant." Mitchell paused again, letting the word hang in the air like smoke. Defiant. To Crawford, defiance was apparently a crime. "Thank you, Detective. We will return to this shortly." But in that exchange, the first crack had already appeared in Crawford's carefully constructed story. He didn't know it yet, but the foundation beneath his arrogance was beginning to crumble. Judge Mitchell turned the page of her notes with deliberate care. Beneath her calm exterior, her mind was racing, flashing through the countless files that had crossed her desk in recent months. There was a pattern to Crawford's arrests. She had seen it too many times to dismiss it as coincidence. 15 names, 17 arrests, all teenagers, all black, all facing charges built from smoke and mirrors. Disorderly conduct, no drugs, no weapons, no violent acts. Just children criminalized for existing in public spaces. She took a breath and fixed her eyes on Crawford. "Detective, let's broaden our view for a moment. In your past 18 months of patrol duty, how many juveniles have you arrested for behavioral violations alone?" Crawford shifted slightly, his confidence flickering for a split second before he caught himself. "I don't have an exact figure, Your Honor. Perhaps 60 to 70 cases. Many resolved with citations or diversions." "And of those 60 or 70 cases," Mitchell pressed, "how many involved African American youth?" The question dropped into the room like a lead weight. Crawford's smile thinned. His fingers tapped once against the armrest. "I don't keep racial statistics, Your Honor. My actions are based on behavior, not skin color." "That's admirable," Mitchell replied, her voice still cool but sharp. "But according to census data, your patrol area is 38% black. Yet, preliminary case audits suggest that over 85% of your juvenile arrests involve black youth. Would you care to explain that discrepancy?" A murmur ran through the gallery. Angela Williams closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself for whatever lie might come next. Crawford's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, the smooth-talking detective seemed at a loss for words. "Your Honor," he finally said, "certain neighborhoods experience higher crime rates, regardless of demographics. I go where the crime is." And these higher crime rates, do they correlate with any specific types of calls? Drug offenses, property crimes, violent incidents? "Mostly behavioral disturbances," Crawford replied, regaining some of his footing. "Disorderly conduct, loitering, verbal altercations that escalate." Mitchell tapped her pen against the desk, letting his words echo in the silence. Behavioral disturbances, another phrase that meant everything and nothing. She flipped to a file at the top of her stack. The name stared back at her, colder than winter air. Malik Thompson, 16, deceased. "Detective Crawford," Mitchell said softly, "do you recall your encounter with Malik Thompson 2 years ago?" A shadow crossed Crawford's face, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, Your Honor. A tragic incident. Mr. Thompson presented a threat during a routine traffic stop. I was forced to discharge my weapon, in defense of my life." Mitchell stared at him for a long moment. 2 years ago, she had accepted that explanation, without question. But since then, pieces had surfaced that changed everything. And now, with fresh eyes, the official story reeked of fabrication. "No weapon was recovered at the scene, correct?" she asked. Crawford's jaw tightened. "That's what the official report stated, yes. But the threat indicators were present." Threat indicators. The same hollow phrase. The same justification for a dead black child whose only crime was being afraid. Mitchell nodded slowly and closed the file with a soft thud. The air in the courtroom shifted again. People were no longer watching a routine case. They were watching a reckoning unfold, one question at a time. The energy inside courtroom 7A had changed. Even those who tried to remain neutral, court clerks, junior attorneys, journalists scribbling notes in the back, could feel it. This wasn't a simple juvenile case anymore. This was the beginning of something much larger, something dangerous and raw. People shifted in their seats, leaning forward, waiting for what they sensed was coming next. Detective Crawford adjusted his collar, the first real sign that he felt the temperature rising. But still, he clung to his arrogance like a shield. His body language screamed defiance. In his mind, he was still the man in control. This was his courtroom. This was his town. He had survived dozens of cases like this before. No black woman in a robe would be the one to take him down, or so he thought. Judge Mitchell set her pen down carefully. No rush, no anger, just steady, unrelenting pressure. "Detective Crawford, when you filed your report on Ms. Williams, did you use the same terminology you've used in your previous juvenile arrests?" Crawford blinked, thrown slightly off balance by the question's simplicity. "Yes, Your Honor. Standard language for behavioral escalation." Mitchell's gaze didn't waver, such as hostile demeanor, non-compliant stance, aggressive tone. Phrases like those. "Your Honor, those are consistent descriptors for potentially volatile interactions." "And yet," she said, flipping through the files again, "I noticed that in over a dozen of your cases, those exact phrases appear word for word, across different arrests, different children, different situations, almost as if you were copying from a template, rather than describing unique events." The room fell deathly still. Angela Williams sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Kesha's hands trembled slightly in her lap, but her chin stayed high. Crawford's smile faltered. "Your Honor, law enforcement officers are trained to recognize consistent threat patterns. Similar behaviors yield similar language." "Or," Mitchell countered, her voice sharpening, "consistent language creates the illusion of consistent threats." For the first time, Crawford's confidence cracked enough to show something beneath it. "Irritation with respect, Your Honor. I've served this community for 15 years. I know when someone is preparing to cause trouble." There it was, the assumption at the heart of it all. Mitchell let the silence linger. "Tell me, detective," she continued, her voice soft but steady. "What exactly does trouble look like? Is it a 15-minute honor roll student waiting for a bus? Is it a 16-minute-old grocery store clerk walking home from work?" Crawford's jaw clenched. "I make my judgments based on behavior, not appearance." "And yet," Mitchell said, her voice now like steel beneath silk, "your arrest records paint a different picture. One where black youth are criminalized, not for their actions, but for your perception of their existence." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some lawyers exchanged knowing glances. A few spectators lowered their heads, as if ashamed for not having spoken up sooner. Crawford leaned back in his chair, arms crossed now. The smug grin was gone, replaced by a mask of cold calculation. But Mitchell could see it, the first visible crack in his armor. He still believed he could control the outcome, still believed his badge would protect him. But the storm he had built with years of unchecked power was finally closing in. And in that courtroom, for the first time in his career, Ryan Crawford was no longer the one holding the gavel. Judge Mitchell's voice was calm, but the sharpness beneath it cut like glass. She leaned forward slightly, placing both hands on the bench, her gaze steady and unmoving. The room fell into stillness, as if every person inside was holding their breath. "Detective Crawford, let's return to the moment of Miss Williams' arrest," she said slowly. "You stated earlier that she maintained eye contact during your verbal commands. Is that correct?" Crawford gave a tight smile, as though the question was beneath him. "Yes, Your Honor. She held eye contact in what I assessed as a confrontational manner." Mitchell paused for a moment, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. "Are you suggesting that eye contact from a 15-year-old girl is a sign of aggression?" He shifted slightly, but kept his voice even. "In law enforcement training, prolonged eye contact can sometimes be a precursor to defiance or hostility, Your Honor." The courtroom stirred. A few people exchanged incredulous looks. Even some of the defense attorneys, used to the rough edges of police testimony, found themselves glancing up, disbelief crossing their faces. Mitchell didn't blink. "Detective Crawford, is it your professional opinion that making eye contact with an officer is disorderly conduct?" Crawford hesitated, just for a moment, and in that pause, the room felt it, the tremor in his armor. "Context matters, Your Honor," he replied, voice tightening. "In situations where a suspect refuses to comply with verbal commands, behaviors like sustained eye contact can escalate tension." Mitchell tilted her head, voice sharpening like a blade. "So, in your view, compliance means what exactly? Eyes down? Shoulders slumped? Silence? Is respectful conduct defined as submission, detective?" The question hit like a thunderclap. The room went still. Angela Williams covered her mouth with her hand. Kesha sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Crawford's lips thinned, his confidence beginning to crack. Respectful conduct means following lawful orders without attitude or resistance. "Without attitude," Mitchell repeated slowly. "Tell me, detective, how do you measure attitude? With a stopwatch? A ruler? Or simply your own perception of whether someone fears you enough?" Crawford's jaw clenched, but the room was already shifting. The gallery felt it. The witnesses felt it. Even the stenographer, fingers hovering above the keys, felt it. A cop had just admitted in open court that in his world, looking a white officer in the eye was enough to get you arrested. And there it was, laid bare for everyone to see. Judge Mitchell allowed the silence to stretch. The whole room was watching Crawford now, watching his words, watching his body language. But Crawford mistook that silence for hesitation, not understanding that what they were witnessing was his mask slipping. She straightened, flipping to a document in the case file. "Let's look at the numbers, detective. In your precinct, the black population makes up 38% of the juvenile demographic. Would you agree with that?" Crawford nodded cautiously, not sure where she was going. Roughly, yes. And yet, according to departmental records, 85% of your juvenile arrests over the last 18 months involved black teenagers. That is more than double their representation in the community. Would you care to explain that discrepancy? The tension in the room tightened like a pulled wire. Angela Williams closed her eyes. Kesha's fingers gripped the edge of the table. Her breath caught in her throat. Crawford shifted in his chair, annoyance creeping into his voice. Your Honor, I patrol where the problems are. My arrests reflect behavior, not race. I don't choose who breaks the law. Mitchell's gaze stayed steady. And what law was Kesha Williams breaking? Was she dealing drugs, carrying weapons, threatening public safety? Crawford's voice sharpened, more defensive now. She was refusing lawful commands and displaying defiance during a field interaction. By making eye contact and not shrinking away, Mitchell said flatly. He sat back, his arms crossing, his expression hardening. Your Honor, you're twisting this. I make decisions based on safety, period. Safety for whom, Detective? For the public? Or for your own ego? The room went still again. Even the air felt heavy. Crawford's face flushed red, but he forced a tight smile. With respect, I've spent 15 years protecting this community. I know the difference between respect and defiance. And apparently, in your view, that difference is, who's looking back at you, Mitchell answered, her voice quiet but cutting. Because your arrest patterns suggest that when white teens make eye contact, it's confidence. But when black teens do it, it's defiance. Crawford opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mitchell leaned in slightly, delivering the question that had been building since the moment this hearing began. Tell me, Detective, what crime is it to be black and unafraid of you? The room froze. No sound, no movement, nothing but the question hanging in the air, waiting for an answer that would not come. And in that silence, the first real crack split Crawford's composure wide open. He didn't have an answer. Not one the world could accept. Judge Mitchell allowed the weight of her question to settle over the courtroom like a storm cloud, refusing to break. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone in that room confront the truth they already knew. Crawford shifted in his seat, his mouth tightening, his hands clenching just a little too hard against the armrests. But no matter how he adjusted his posture, no amount of authority in his voice could answer the question that exposed the sickness at the core of his policing. Mitchell flipped to another file. A name stared back at her in bold black print. Malik Thompson, 16 years old, shot and killed by Crawford during a so-called routine stop 2 years ago. She tapped the file lightly as if summoning the ghost that still lingered over this courtroom. Detective Crawford, she began, her tone lowering, steadier now, colder. You mentioned earlier that you assess situations for threats, that you act in the interests of safety. Was that also true when you encountered Malik Thompson? The color drained from Crawford's face for the first time. His jaw tensed, and his voice lost its earlier bravado. Your Honor, that case was reviewed, cleared. The investigation ruled it a justified shooting. No weapon was found at the scene, Mitchell continued. Her eyes went each. And the initial report stated the subject was retreating, not advancing. Do you stand by your account today? Crawford's eyes darted to the prosecutor's table, then to the back of the courtroom, where several plainclothed federal agents sat, watching, waiting. He swallowed hard. I stand by the findings of the investigation. Mitchell leaned forward slightly. Which investigation, Detective? The one that cleared you without reviewing all the evidence? Or the one I've been quietly conducting in this courtroom? A collective murmur swept through the gallery. Journalists scribbled furiously. Lawyers exchanged startled glances. Angela Williams clutched Kesha's hand, sensing that the ground was about to shift beneath them all. Crawford straightened, his voice harder now, sharp with warning. Your Honor, with respect, this is a juvenile hearing. You're stepping beyond the scope of the case. Mitchell didn't blink. You brought this scope upon yourself the moment you made false arrests and filed fabricated reports. The moment you turned protecting your community into hunting it. The crack in Crawford's mask became a fracture. His smile faltered, his shoulders stiffened, and for the first time since walking into courtroom 7, Detective Ryan Crawford looked unsure of his footing. But Mitchell wasn't done. She flipped to another page, her fingers steady. Tell me, detective, how many more Malik Thompsons have there been? How many more young people had their futures stolen because they dared to exist while black on your streets? The room held its breath. Crawford clenched his jaw and forced a thin, bitter smile. I don't answer to political agendas, Your Honor. I answer to the law. Mitchell let the words hang for a beat, then responded quietly. Then, you should have remembered that before you broke it. And for the first time, the courtroom saw itself. Not a protector, not a peacekeeper, just a man cornered by his own lies. And the storm hadn't even begun. 2 weeks before the courtroom showdown, Judge Diane Mitchell sat alone in her chambers, long after the courthouse had emptied for the night. The case files spread before her told a story she could no longer ignore. Malik Thompson's name stared up from the worn folder like a ghost refusing to rest. The official report said Malik was armed, aggressive. Advancing about that story had never fit. Not with the boy's school records, his part-time job at the grocery store, his clean, juvenile record. And then, on a quiet Thursday evening, her office door opened without a knock. Detective Lisa Chen from Internal Affairs stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. Chen's face carried the weariness of someone who had spent too long standing alone in the dark. Your Honor, Chen said, her voice low but steady. I have something you need to see, something no one else was supposed to find. From her coat, Chen pulled a manila folder thick with documents, pages stamped confidential, some marked for destruction. She laid them out carefully on Mitchell's desk, the edges trembling slightly, as if they carried the weight of too many silences. This is Crawford's original incident report from the Malik Thompson shooting, Chen said, her eyes meeting Mitchell's with quiet urgency. Before it was sanitized. Mitchell's breath caught as she read the first few lines. Unlike the official version, this report described Malik as retreating when Crawford fired. There was no mention of a weapon recovered at the scene, no aggressive posturing, no threat, only a scared teenage boy trying to get home. There's more, Chen added. Body cam footage. The department claimed it was corrupted during upload, but I found a copy buried in the evidence archives. It was never lost. It was hidden. Mitchell sat back, the room spinning slightly. For months, she had suspected Crawford's reports were riddled with lies. But seeing it in writing, seeing the evidence, buried beneath official narratives, made the truth undeniable. Mitchell long ago? Mitchell asked. 6 months, Chen replied quietly. I've been trying to build a case, but every time I get close, the evidence disappears. Witnesses back out. Files go missing. It's bigger than Crawford. His supervisors are protecting him. Mitchell closed the folder slowly, her heart pounding. This wasn't just one bad cop. This was a system designed to protect him. She met Chen's eyes again. Are you ready to bring this into the light? Chen hesitated, then gave a single resolute nod. It's past time. Mitchell rose from her chair, feeling the weight of what was to come settle over her shoulders. She would call in federal oversight. She would order the evidence logged for public record. And she would do it all in open court. The storm was coming, and she was done waiting for it to pass. In the weeks that followed, Judge Mitchell worked quietly but relentlessly. Every night after court recess, she reviewed the documents Detective Chen had given her. Each page added another nail to the coffin of Crawford's false narrative. Witness interviews that contradicted his report, forensic evidence that didn't match his story, and then, buried deep within the files, the body cam metadata, the file ID numbers, the time-slept logs, proof that the footage existed long after the department claimed It had been lost. The body cam file was the smoking gun. It showed everything. Malik Thompson, scared and cornered, his hands clearly visible, empty. The boy had been running away, not charging forward, and when Crawford raised his weapon, Malik had stopped, raised his hands, and pleaded for his life. The shot that followed wasn't a reaction to danger. It was an execution. Judge Mitchell sat in her chambers one night, the laptop's glow illuminating her face as the footage played. She watched Malik's final moments again and again, each time feeling the weight press heavier against her chest. She could hear his voice, the fear in it, the confusion. "Please, don't shoot. I just want to go home." And then, the single shot that silenced a child forever. She closed the laptop and sat in the darkness for a long time, the tears finally slipping free. This wasn't just about Crawford anymore. This was about every system that had failed Malik, every supervisor who had signed off on a lie, every prosecutor who had looked the other way, every officer who had stayed silent. But not everyone had stayed silent. Lisa Chen had risked everything to bring the truth forward. Mitchell couldn't let that sacrifice be wasted. The next morning, before the courtroom opened, Mitchell met with her court administrator, Maria Rodriguez. Together, they carefully logged the documents into the court record, securing them against tampering, marking them for public release if anything happened to either of them. Then Mitchell made a quiet call to the U.S. Attorney's Office. She didn't need to explain much. By then, federal investigators had already been watching Riverside County for months. What she had would give them the final evidence they needed. The agents didn't ask for delay. They said they'd be there, watching. And so, when Judge Mitchell entered the courtroom that morning, she did so knowing that beneath the surface of this seemingly routine hearing, a war was about to begin. She looked out across the room, seeing faces she didn't recognize, men and women in plain suits, seated in the gallery, their exact zooms unreadable. She knew who they were, federal agents, eyes on every corner of the room, recording everything. And Crawford, striding into the courtroom with his usual swagger, had no idea his downfall had already begun. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the first move was about to be made. Judge Mitchell took her seat on the bench and opened the file in front of her, her expression calm but resolute. The courtroom filled with the usual low hum of rustling papers and shifting bodies, but those paying attention could feel something different in the air. A quiet tension, an invisible thread stretched tight, waiting to snap. Across from her, Detective Ryan Crawford leaned back in the witness chair, wearing his usual smirk. He didn't see the agents scattered among the spectators. He didn't see the quiet preparations unfolding behind the scenes. He still believed this was his courtroom, that this was his story to tell. But Judge Mitchell had spent too many sleepless nights reading his lies to let him dictate the narrative any longer. She cleared her throat, and the room fell silent. "Detective Crawford," she began, her voice steady, "before we continue, the court will be entering into the record additional evidence regarding your involvement in the Malik Thompson case." Crawford's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he recovered quickly, his voice smooth. "Your Honor, with respect, that case was closed over 2 years ago. The district attorney's office cleared me of wrongdoing. I don't see how it's relevant to today's hearing." Mitchell's gaze didn't waver. "Relevance will become clear momentarily, Detective." She gestured to Maria Rodriguez, who walked forward carrying a sealed evidence folder and a slim laptop. Maria's hands were steady as she placed the items on the bench, her eyes flicking briefly toward the federal agents seated behind Crawford. The agents gave the smallest of nods. The trap was nearly sprung. Mitchell opened the folder with deliberate care, lifting out the original incident report, the one Lisa Chen had risked everything to save. She held it up, letting the courtroom see the handwritten notes in Crawford's own script. "This is your initial report from the night of Malik Thompson's death, filed electronically before the official version was edited. It states that Malik was retreating at the time of the shooting and that no weapon was visible when you fired. Is that correct? Crawford stiffened. His throat worked as he tried to summon the arrogance he wore like armor. Preliminary reports are often incomplete, Your Honor. Stressful situations can lead to inaccuracies in initial observations. Mitchell's voice turned colder. And yet, the final report describes Malik as advancing aggressively and reaching for a weapon. A weapon, I might add, that was never recovered. Crawford's hands tightened on the armrests. I followed department protocol. I responded to a perceived threat. Mitchell exchanged a brief glance with Maria, who opened the laptop and queued up the body cam footage. We'll let the footage speak for itself. The room went silent as the first frame flickered to life. The shaky, nighttime footage illuminated Malik Thompson's terrified face, hands raised, pleading for his life. The truth, long buried beneath lies and signatures, was finally ready to be heard. And as the first gasps rippled through the courtroom, Crawford's bravado cracked wide open. He knew. This was the beginning of the end. The quiet hum of the courtroom was gone. In its place was a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint static from the laptop speakers. Judge Mitchell sat upright, her voice calm but unmistakably sharp as she addressed Crawford, who now sat stiffly in the witness chair. Detective Crawford, she said, flipping through the thick folder of evidence, let's return to your official account of the Malik Thompson shooting. You testified that Malik was an armed suspect who advanced toward you, correct? Crawford's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He nodded, forcing the words out. Yes, Your Honor. I perceived an imminent threat and acted according to department protocol. And you described it as a split-second decision made in self-defense. Yes. Correct, Crawford answered, his voice low but steady. It was an unfortunate situation, but necessary to protect myself and others. Mitchell paused, letting the lie sit there for a moment. Then she turned to a page marked with Crawford's own handwriting. The court clerk handed it to her, and she read aloud, her voice steady and clear. Subject appeared to be retreating when engagement began. No weapon visible at time of first shot. Hands raised, indicating possible compliance. She closed the folder with a soft but final thud. Those are your words, Detective, written hours after the incident, before anyone had a chance to edit or sanitize the report. Were you lying then, or are you lying now? Crawford stiffened, color draining from his face. His mouth opened, then closed again. A low murmur spread through the gallery, as people leaned forward, watching the walls close in. I was under extreme stress at the time, Your Honor, he stammered. Details may have been unclear in the moment. Mitchell's eyes narrowed slightly. Unclear in the moment, or clearer before your supervisors coached you on what to say. The question hung there, sharp and cutting. Tell me, Mitchell continued, her voice soft but relentless. Where in your training manual does it say to shoot a retreating, unarmed child? Crawford's hands gripped the arms of the witness chair, knuckles white against the dark wood, but no answer came. He was caught. And for the first time in his career, there was nowhere left to run. Maria Rodriguez, steady as ever, adjusted the courtroom projector as Judge Mitchell gave a quiet nod. And then, without fanfare or warning, the screen lit up with the body cam footage that had been buried in darkness for 2 long years. The courtroom fell into a hush so deep it was as if the air itself had been pulled from the room. The screen flickered, time-stamped March 15th, 9:23 p.m. The shaky camera view caught glimpses of quiet streets, the hum of traffic in the distance, the rustle of night air. Then there he was, Malik Thompson, 16, slight, his face framed by fear. A grocery store uniform clung to his thin frame, the name tag reflecting briefly in the streetlight. Subject observed moving between parked vehicles, Crawford's recorded voice said, calm and clinical, like he was describing a suspect in a war zone, not a frightened child. On the screen, Malik froze as Crawford's flashlight beam found him. His hands went up immediately, trembling, but clearly empty. His voice, thin and shaking, filled the room like a cry from beyond the grave. "Please, sir, I'm just trying to get home. I work at the market basket. I'm just trying to get home." Several people in the courtroom covered their mouths, gasping quietly. Angela Williams clutched Kesha's hand, tears filling her eyes. Even some of the attorneys shifted uncomfortably, unable to reconcile the boy on the screen with the predator Crawford had described in his reports. The camera continued to roll. Malik's body pressed against a chain-link fence. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. His hands stayed up, fingers spread, shaking but visible. "I don't have anything. You can search me. Please don't shoot me. I got a little sister at home." And then came the words that burned the room down. Subject displaying threat indicators. Preparing to assess compliance level, Crawford's recorded voice said flatly. On the screen, Malik didn't move, didn't reach for anything, didn't do a single thing except beg for his life. "Please, sir, I'll do whatever you say. Just let me go home." And then, the snap of Shrek. Malik crumpled to the pavement like a broken promise. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The footage faded to black. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was Crawford's quiet, shaky breathing, amplified by the silence around him. Judge Mitchell's voice broke the stillness, soft but razor-sharp. "Detective Crawford, where in that video did you see a weapon? Where in that child's face did you see a threat?" Crawford's voice was almost a whisper now, barely holding together. "You don't understand what it's like out there. You don't know how fast things can happen. We don't have the luxury of second-guessing." Mitchell leaned forward, her voice like steel. "No, detective. What you didn't have was the courage to admit you were wrong. What you didn't have was the humanity to see that boy as someone worth protecting." And in that moment, the courtroom saw Crawford as he truly was. Not a protector, not a hero, but a man hiding behind his badge, caught in the truth he could no longer escape. Such a Crawford sat frozen, his shoulders tense, his fingers gripping the witness stand like a drowning man clinging to wreckage. But the water was rising fast, and the lies he'd built his career on could no longer keep him afloat. Judge Mitchell's voice softened, but it cut even deeper. "Detective Crawford, protecting your community means preserving life, not ending it out of fear. Covering up a murder doesn't make you a protector. It makes you a criminal." The words hit him harder than the evidence. For the first time, the courtroom saw it. The fear behind the arrogance. He tried to speak, but the words came out brittle, cracked, and hollow. I did what I was trained to do," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I followed protocol. I feared for my safety." Mitchell's gaze didn't waver. Protocol doesn't justify killing a child with his hands raised. Fear doesn't excuse murder. What you did wasn't training, it was execution. The weight of her words sank into the room. No one moved. Even the federal agent seated in the back remained still, letting the silence settle like a final verdict. Crawford tried to recover, but his excuses fell apart before they left his lips. "I made a judgment call. It's easy to question it now, but in that moment..." Mitchell cut him off, her voice rising just enough to silence him. "In that moment, detective, you had a choice, and you chose to end a life that posed no threat to you. A boy going home from work, a boy who deserved to grow up." Crawford's mask cracked again. The anger that always hid just beneath his skin started to seep through. "You sit up there and judge me, but you've never walked those streets. You've never had to decide in seconds whether you'll make it home alive." Mitchell leaned forward, meeting his eyes without flinching. "And you think that boy didn't make those choices every day? You think Malik didn't have to decide whether walking home in his uniform would get him killed?" The question silenced even Crawford's rage. For a brief, fleeting moment, something broke in his expression. Beneath the bitterness and hate, beneath the arrogance, was something raw, something small, maybe regret, maybe just the hollow recognition that the walls were closing in and there was nowhere left to run. Mitchell softened her voice. You didn't just fail Malik Thompson. You failed every child in your patrol. You failed the badge you wore. And now you will answer for it. Crawford's hands dropped from the armrests, his shoulders sagging in defeat. But the reckoning was far from over. Judge Mitchell turned to the court administrator. Maria, please prepare the next exhibit. The court will now review additional communications from Detective Crawford's internal messaging logs. The room braced for what was coming. Because as devastating as the body cam footage had been, it was only the beginning. The truth about how deep this corruption ran was about to be exposed. And Crawford, his story of false heroism, was about to collapse completely. The courtroom had barely begun to absorb the horror of the body cam footage when Judge Mitchell gave a quiet nod to Maria Rodriguez. Another file was queued on the laptop, the next blow waiting in silence. Maria adjusted the speakers. The gallery leaned forward, bracing for what they could not yet imagine. Detective Crawford, Mitchell said, her voice calm but loaded with purpose. Do you recall a conversation you had with Lieutenant Marcus Hayes approximately 6 weeks after Malik Thompson's death? Crawford's body stiffened. He blinked, slower this time, as if measuring the danger he suddenly recognized. I've had many conversations with Lieutenant Hayes, Your Honor, none of them relevant to this proceeding. Mitchell arched an eyebrow. We'll let the recording decide that. Maria pressed play. The crackle of barroom background noise filled the room. Clinking glasses, muffled voices, laughter that carried a chilling undercurrent. And then, clear as day, came Crawford's voice, slurred but unmistakably his. You know, Hayes, Crawford's recorded voice said, sometimes I think about that Thompson kid. Not because I feel bad. Laughter followed. Then Lieutenant Hayes' voice, smooth and cold. Exactly, brother. That's how you keep these punks in line. Fear is better than respect. Respect fades. Fear stays. The courtroom froze. Some people gasped softly. Others exchanged horrified looks, unable to process the casual cruelty of what they were hearing. Crawford sat rigid in his chair, his face drained of color. On the recording, Crawford laughed again, darker this time. Sometimes you gotta put a kid down to keep the others in check. No one wants to be the next Moloch. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Angela Williams wiped tears from her eyes, holding Keisha's trembling hand. Journalists, their pens motionless, simply stared at the floor. Even defense attorneys, veterans of countless courtroom battles, sat speechless. Mitchell paused the recording, letting the weight of what they'd heard settle into every crack of the marble wall. This, Mitchell said, her voice low and steady, isn't just reckless policing. This is murder used as a tool of intimidation, a deliberate strategy to terrorize children in your community. She turned to Crawford, whose bravado had completely vanished. And you laughed about it. You called it a message. Crawford's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, even he knew there was no explanation, no defense. There was only the truth. And it was finally, mercilessly, out in the open. Judge Mitchell didn't stop there. She flipped to another file, this one thicker, heavier, built from months of whispers and warnings. She leveled her gaze at Crawford, then addressed the entire courtroom. What we have uncovered is not the work of one rogue officer. It is a culture, a system, a brotherhood of silence. She opened the file and began reading names, officers, supervisors, training sergeants, each linked to dozens of cases just like Malik's. Their reports used the same phrase: aggressive body language, threatening tone, pre-criminal behavior. The same justifications repeated over and over, like a script. But it wasn't just the language, it was the training. New recruits in the precinct were taught how to frame black teens as threats. Judge Mitchell read aloud from one rookie officer's training notes, seized from an internal email. Detective Crawford says you look for the stare. If they look you in the eye too long, they're sizing you up. If they look away, they're hiding something. Either way, they're a threat. Don't hesitate. Better to act first and explain later. Gasp rippled through the courtroom. She continued, her voice cold as steel. These weren't isolated mistakes. These were instructions. This was a manual on how to dehumanize children. On the defense bench, one of the public defenders, quiet until now, leaned forward, his voice sharp with disbelief. Your Honor, are you saying this was official precinct policy? Mitchell looked straight at him. Unofficial, but widespread and protected by leadership. She turned back to the gallery. Every officer who learned this method, every supervisor who let it continue, and every prosecutor who ignored the patterns, they all played a part in what happened to Malik Thompson. And to how many others? The weight of it was staggering. The press, once content to scribble notes, now sat wide-eyed, recording every word. Community leaders exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had long suspected something deeper was wrong, but hearing it confirmed, in a court of law, felt like the ground shifting beneath their feet. Federal agents in the back row exchanged brief nods, subtle but unmistakable. Arrests beyond Crawford were no longer hypothetical. They were inevitable. And Crawford? He sat like a man watching his kingdom burn. Because it wasn't just his career ending. It was the entire empire he helped build. The ripple effect from Judge Mitchell's revelations traveled through the courtroom like a tidal wave, touching every person in its path. In the front row, parents of other black teens shifted in their seats, memories of their own children's arrests resurfacing with fresh horror. Lawyers whispered urgently, already planning motions for case reviews. And at the back of the room, those quiet, sharp-eyed federal agents stood a little straighter, their faces hardening with purpose. Mitchell gathered the remaining documents and looked toward the gallery, her voice dropping to a low but steady pulse that filled every corner of the room. For years, Detective Crawford's methods weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. He was promoted, awarded, and held up as a model officer. But the evidence shows otherwise. He wasn't protecting this community, he was preying on it. She let the words sink in before continuing. The truth is, this precinct trained its officers not to protect life, but to control it. And who they controlled depended on the color of your skin, the clothes you wore, the street you lived on. And when one life was stolen, they didn't grieve. They joked about it. They used that death to scare other children into silence. The room held its breath. From his chair, Crawford gave a bitter, hollow laugh. You make it sound so simple, Your Honor. Like the streets are some fairy tale where bad cops hunt innocent kids. It's not like that out there. You don't know what it's like. Mitchell didn't flinch. Oh, but I do, Detective. I know what it's like to walk through this world in a black body. I know what it's like to be treated as a threat before you've spoken a word. I know what it's like to look into the eyes of someone with power and know they've already decided who you are. She paused, her gaze locking onto Crawford's. But unlike you, I didn't let fear turn me into a monster. The impact of her words silenced even Crawford's fading defiance. Public defenders along the sidewall exchanged grim nods. They knew they had just heard the turning point, not only in this trial, but in the entire way the community would understand justice moving forward. This wasn't just one corrupt cop. It was a cancer, and today, finally, someone was cutting it out. In the gallery, one man stood, Pastor Jeremiah Lucas, who had buried too many neighborhood boys like Malik Thompson, stepped forward and spoke, not loudly, but with a quiet conviction that carried across the room. How many more names are in those files, Judge? He asked. How many more children? Mitchell met his gaze with quiet sorrow. Too many. Another voice, sharper, rang out from the back. A journalist. Are there other officers under investigation? A curios refused. Other precincts? Mitchell didn't hesitate. I cannot speak to ongoing investigations, but I will say this. Riverside County will no longer be a safe haven for those who abuse their badge. The words landed like a promise. At the rear of the courtroom, 2 federal agents quietly exited, speaking into secure radios as they left. Arrest teams were already mobilizing across the city. Search warrants had been signed, surveillance reviewed. Crawford was only the first. And in the midst of it all, Crawford sat alone. No backup, no badge to protect him now. His gaze darted around the room, looking for an ally that no longer existed. Judge Mitchell's voice softened for the final blow. "Detective Crawford, you spent your career telling black children they didn't belong in this city unless they bowed their heads. You taught them that dignity was a crime, but today they heard something different. They heard the truth." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the weight of every name erased from police records, every child whose voice was silenced, every family who had waited for this day. And finally, softly, from the front row, Keisha Williams spoke. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "He couldn't break us." The room held still, the final word hanging like a banner over Crawford's ruin. And as the agents returned, ready to take him into federal custody, one thing was clear. The era of silence was over. The courtroom sat frozen in the aftershock of what it had just witnessed. The body cam footage, the secret recordings, the exposed brotherhood of corruption, it was all too much for most to process at once. But one man, sitting at the center of the storm, wasn't calculating his next defense. He was boiling. Detective Ryan Crawford clenched the arms of the witness chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. The man who had strutted into this courtroom, believing he controlled the narrative, now sat exposed and cornered, a lion stripped of his pride. And, in his desperation, the mask finally slipped. His voice, sharp and venomous, cut through the tension. "This isn't justice, Judge Mitchell. This is a political witch hunt." The gallery turned toward him, stunned by his audacity. He sneered, spitting the words like poison. "You people sit up there in your robes, pretending to care about law and order, but all you're doing is protecting criminals and destroying good cops." Mitchell's eyes didn't waver. Her silence gave him space to bury himself deeper. Crawford leaned forward, his voice dropping to a growl that echoed in the stunned quiet. "You think anyone out there respects your authority? Citizens who look like you? They don't care about the law. They only respect power." The phrase landed like a slap across the face of the entire courtroom. The word "citizens who looked like you" exposed everything. His prejudice, his worldview, his hatred, laid bare for all to see. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Kesha flinched as if struck. Angela Williams closed her eyes, fighting back tears. Even seasoned attorneys shook their heads in disbelief. Mitchell didn't blink. Her voice, calm and clear, cut through the stillness. "Detective Crawford, the only thing the citizens of this country fear is unchecked power wielded by men who confuse hatred with duty. And today, that power is ending." But Crawford couldn't hear her anymore. He was too far gone. Too blinded by rage to recognize the walls closing in around him. Too desperate to realize he'd already lost. And in the next instant, he made the choice that would seal his fate forever. In one violent instant, Ryan Crawford's rage overtook what little restraint he had left. He shot to his feet, the suddenness of the movement startling the entire courtroom. The room tensed, but no one reacted fast enough. Crawford took one step forward, closing the distance to the bench, his face twisted in a hateful sneer. "You think you can humiliate me?" he hissed. "You think your robe makes you untouchable?" And then it happened. His booted foot swung in a vicious arc, faster than anyone expected. It slammed into Judge Mitchell's stomach with brutal force, knocking the wind from her lungs and sending her stumbling backward into her chair. The sound of the impact, a sharp, sickening crack, reverberated through the chamber. Gasps and screams tore through the gallery. Angela Williams covered Kesha's eyes, pulling her daughter into a protective embrace. Lawyers jumped to their feet, shouting for order. Court security lunged forward as the room exploded into chaos. But through it all, Mitchell did not fall. She clutched the edge of the bench, her body doubled in pain, but her resolve unbroken. Slowly, painstakingly, she pulled herself upright, her face pale, but her gaze unwavering. Even in agony, she would not let him win. "Let the record reflect," she gasped, her voice hoarse but steady, "that Detective Ryan Crawford has just assaulted a sitting judge in open court." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words crashing down like a gavel. Crawford stood there for a beat, chest heaving, realizing far too late what he had done. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had frozen him on one side of the bench, her on the other, dignity and hatred staring each other down in the wreckage of what used to be law and order. And then federal agents moved. They struck fast and without hesitation. Special Agent Sarah Chen and two others converged on Crawford from opposite sides, their movements sharp and practiced. His arms were yanked behind his back before he could resist, the cold snap of handcuffs echoing across the marble walls. "Ryan Crawford," Agent Chen announced, her voice calm but commanding, "you are under arrest for assaulting a federal judicial officer, a violation of Title 18 of the United States Code. You are also facing charges of civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder." Crawford didn't fight them. Not anymore. All the fight, all the bluster, drained from his body as they forced him to his knees. His shoulders slumped as the reality crashed in. It was over. The man who had terrorized an entire community, who had worn his badge like a weapon and his racism like armor, was now just another criminal, caught, exposed, and powerless. And as they dragged him from the courtroom, his boots scraping against the polished floor, he didn't say another word. Because there was nothing left to say. The silence that followed Crawford's removal was thick and suffocating, broken only by Judge Mitchell's slow, steady breaths as she gathered herself behind the bench. Every person in that courtroom had just witnessed something they would carry for the rest of their lives. Violence, raw and unapologetic, had unfolded where justice was meant to reign, but even battered, Judge Mitchell refused to let it define her. She adjusted her robe with trembling hands, masking the pain radiating through her ribs. Then, in a voice steadier than anyone expected, she spoke into the official court record. "Let the record further reflect," she began, her voice resonating with quiet defiance, "that despite sustaining a violent assault from Detective Ryan Crawford in the performance of my duties, this court will not be silenced. Violence against this bench is violence against the Constitution itself, and it will not stand." Her words echoed in the chamber, restoring the order Crawford had tried to destroy. Slowly, cautiously, the room began to breathe again. Maria Rodriguez approached the bench, her face stricken with concern. "Your Honor, are you sure you want to continue today? We can recess. We can—" Mitchell raised a hand, stopping her gently. "No, Maria. We finish this today." Across the room, journalists typed furiously, broadcasting every word to a nation that would soon be watching this story unfold in headlines and breaking news alerts. Community leaders whispered among themselves, already preparing for what came next. Public defenders sat in stunned silence, realizing that every case tied to Crawford, and possibly many others, would soon be reopened. And then came the slow ripple of something deeper. Realization. Reckoning. The people in this courtroom understood they had just witnessed more than a fall from power. They had witnessed a system exposing its own rot. Crawford's violence wasn't an isolated outburst. It was the inevitable end of unchecked hatred, finally crashing into the wall of accountability. Special Agent Sarah Chen stepped forward, addressing the bench with the quiet gravity of someone who understood the moment's weight. "Your Honor, federal custody of Detective Crawford is now secured. Additional warrants are being executed across Riverside County as we speak. We expect to detain multiple officers before the end of the day." Mitchell nodded, her voice calm despite the chaos still echoing in her bones. See that they are processed with the same fairness they denied their victims." Agent Chen gave a sharp nod. "Yes, Your Honor." As the agents filed out, taking Crawford's crimes with them, Mitchell allowed herself a single moment of stillness. She placed a hand on her chest, feeling the bruised ribs beneath her robes, and drew a long, slow breath. This was far from over. But today the wall cracked. She turned to the court clerk. "Resume the docket. We will reconvene at 1:00 p.m. There was no grand speech, no dramatic exit, just the quiet, steady hum of justice continuing forward, even when battered, even when bruised. And in the front row, Kesha Williams watched, her wide eyes filled not with fear, but with hope. Because she had seen what happened when someone stood their ground. She had seen power break, and dignity remain. While the courtroom buzzed with the aftermath of Crawford's downfall, another operation was already in motion, quiet, relentless, and long overdue. At precisely 8:15 a.m., as the sun rose over the cracked streets of Riverside County, FBI teams executed coordinated arrests across the city. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes was pulled from his suburban home in a quiet, cold assassin, still wearing his department sweatshirt. His stunned wife clutched the doorframe as agents recited the charges: conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder. Across town, Captain Robert Morrison, the architect of the precinct's culture of silence, was cornered in his office at headquarters. He didn't go quietly. Morrison stood as the agents approached, a smug grin creasing his face. "You boys better have the right paperwork, otherwise you're making the biggest mistake of your careers." Special Agent Sarah Chen met his gaze without blinking. "We've got more than paperwork, Captain. We've got recordings, emails, and enough witness testimony to fill a courtroom for months." Morrison's smirk faded, replaced by a bitter scowl. "You think you can take down this department? You have no idea how deep this goes." Chen tilted her head, calm but firm. "Actually, we do, and we'll keep digging until we reach the bottom." The agents cuffed him in front of his staff, young officers who had once followed his orders without question. Now they watched their commander led away like any other criminal. And that was just the beginning. At the East Side Precinct, a squad of internal affairs officers swept through the records room, flanked by FBI tech teams. Filing cabinets were emptied onto the floor, hard drives were removed from computers. Thousands of arrest reports surface, nearly identical in their wording, each one a carbon copy of the last. Disorderly conduct, threatening behavior, suspicious posturing. The suspects, black teenagers, mostly between the ages of 13 and 18. The charges? Manufactured. The outcomes? Plea dealings, juvenile detention, and permanent scars. What they found buried in those reports was not law enforcement. It was oppression, systematic, calculated, and profiting from human lives. As investigators dug deeper into the precinct's records, what began as a pattern soon revealed itself as a machine, a finely tuned system built to criminalize black youth for profit. Hidden among the arrest reports were internal memos, emails, and financial spreadsheets that painted a chilling picture. Officers like Crawford and Hayes weren't just acting on personal prejudice. They were participants in a lucrative pipeline. Each arrest meant higher crime stats, which meant increased federal funding for the precinct. Each arrest of a high-risk juvenile triggered bonuses disguised as community policing awards. And beyond the precinct walls, private security companies and bail bond businesses fed off the chaos. Emails from Morrison showed cozy relationships with local contractors who paid kickbacks for increased arrests in key neighborhoods. One message from Morrison to Hayes was particularly damning. "Keep the numbers up this quarter. Sentinel Security is renewing their neighborhood patrol contract next month. Show them we're keeping the streets clean." Another email chain revealed that a private juvenile detention center offered referral bonuses for every teenager processed through the system. Black teens in particular were labeled as recidivism risks, justifying longer holds and higher payments. It wasn't policing. It was business. And the product they sold was fear. The deeper the investigators went, the worse it became. Training manuals from rookie orientation sessions contained coded language about proactive enforcement and risk-based interventions. These phrases masked instructions to stop young black teens for trivial or non-existent offenses, pushing them into the system before they could finish middle school. Officers were taught how to write reports that criminalized everyday behaviors. One slide from a training PowerPoint read, "Eye contact equals challenge, hands in pockets equals concealment, running equals evasion." Under this system, walking home from school, hanging out at a bus stop, or laughing too loudly in a park could be turned into probable cause. And at the center of it all stood Detective Ryan Crawford. His arrest stats were higher than anyone's, his reports more frequently cited in department briefings, his tactics praised during precinct meetings. He wasn't a rogue officer. He was the blueprint. Federal prosecutors worked through the night drafting conspiracy charges. Internal Affairs prepared disciplinary actions against dozens of officers. By morning, a task force was ready to expand the investigation beyond Riverside County. But amid the legal machinery and government response, the human cost remained staggering. For every line in those reports, there was a child whose life had been derailed, a family whose nights were filled with worry, a community that had learned to fear the flashing lights instead of feeling protected by them. And now, finally, those voices were being heard. Outside the courthouse, a sea of reporters gathered, microphones raised like weapons aimed at the fortress of justice. But when Eleanor Thompson stepped forward, the noise faded. There was something about her quiet presence, something about the grief written across her face, that silenced the chaos. She took the podium without fanfare. No prepared speech. No talking points. Just a mother who had buried her child and refused to let his story be buried with him. "My son Malik was not a statistic," she began, her voice trembling but steady. "He was a brother, a friend, and a child who worked after school to help me pay the bills, and because of a man who saw his skin as a threat, Malik never made it home." The crowd stood silent, the weight of her words falling on them like rain. "You 3 years they told me to be quiet, told me that justice had been served, but it wasn't. Justice means truth. Justice means accountability. And justice means making sure no other mother ever feels what I felt the night my son was stolen from me." She looked toward the courthouse steps, where Judge Mitchell stood watching, her bruises hidden beneath her robe, but her eyes still burning with quiet resolve. "And I am here today," Eleanor continued, "not just for Malik, but for every child whose laughter they tried to silence, for every parent who sat alone in the dark, wondering why their baby didn't come home. We will not be silent anymore." Her words sparked something in the crowd, something bigger than anger, purpose. Kesha Williams stepped beside her, her school uniform still crisp, her honor roll pin shining faintly in the sun. A girl who should have been defined by her grades and her kindness, not by the police reports that tried to rewrite her story. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Kesha said, looking directly at the cameras. "You told me I was dangerous for looking you in the eye, but today the world saw who was really dangerous." She turned slightly, her gaze finding the faces of other young people in the crowd. The young people were not too small to fight back. They thought we wouldn't speak, but we are speaking now, and we're not going to stop until every child is safe in their own neighborhood. The applause that followed wasn't just noise. It was release. It was defiance. It was a promise. Inside the courthouse, Judge Mitchell gathered her files, preparing for the long road ahead. There were still trials to oversee, cases to review, and a broken system to rebuild. But something had shifted. For the first time in years, the courthouse steps weren't a place of fear. They were a place where truth was spoken aloud, where community voices rang louder than police sirens. Federal agents continued their work quietly but efficiently. Within 24 hours, over a dozen additional officers were placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. The East Side Precinct would be placed under federal oversight by week's end, and new subpoenas were issued to private companies implicated in the kickback schemes. But the most powerful shift was harder to quantify. Parents who once feared retaliation now spoke at town halls. Students who once walked home with their heads down now walked together. And in the East Side Community Center, where Malik Thompson used to tutor younger kids, a new mural was painted across the back wall. It showed a boy in a grocery store uniform, standing tall with his hands raised, not in fear, but in peace. Beneath it, a single phrase was written in bold letters. "We are not afraid anymore." The federal courthouse stood tall against the gray morning sky, its stone facade reflecting the gravity of the trials inside. Months of investigation had led to this day, and across the country millions tuned in to watch as the case of Ryan Crawford, Robert Morrison, and Marcus Hayes unfolded in open court. Judge Diane Mitchell was not presiding over this trial, but her presence was everywhere, in the evidence, in the witness lists, and in the moral force that had made this reckoning possible. She sat quietly in the gallery beside Eleanor Thompson, both women witnesses to a moment they had fought for through pain and perseverance. The prosecution began its case with chilling precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the federal prosecutor said, his voice steady but fierce, "this case is about power abused and trust betrayed. It is about a system that protected itself by preying on those it swore to protect. You will hear the voices of those who were silenced. You will see the faces of the children who never came home. And one by one, those voices filled the courtroom." Angela Williams took the stand first, her hands trembling but her words unwavering. She described the terror of watching her daughter, Kesha, treated like a criminal for waiting at a bus stop. "I raised my daughter to speak with dignity, to meet the world with kindness," Angela said, her voice cracking. "But to men like Ryan Crawford, dignity was defiance, and kindness was irrelevant, because her skin was black." The gallery sat in hushed reverence. Then came Malik Thompson's mother. Eleanor stepped to the witness chair, her grief palpable, but her strength unshaken. "My son wasn't a statistic. He was a child who worked part-time to help his family. He was coming home from work when Crawford shot him in the back. And then they called it heroism." Her words broke through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Journalists scribbled furiously, and even the most hardened court officers swallowed hard. But it was the recordings, the voices of Crawford and his fellow officers bragging about using Malik's death as a warning, that stunned the nation. In one clip, played on the courtroom's massive screen, Crawford's voice rang out clearly. "That Thompson kid, he taught the whole neighborhood a lesson. Now they know who runs these streets." The room fell silent as the jury heard his own words condemn him. As the testimonies piled higher and the recordings echoed through the courtroom, the once invincible facade of Riverside's police leadership crumbled. Ryan Crawford sat motionless, his face drained of color as each word, each image, built the undeniable case against him. But it wasn't just his trial anymore. It was a reckoning for every officer, supervisor, and bureaucrat who had protected the machine he helped create. Captain Robert Morrison's arrogance cracked on the stand. Under cross-examination, he could no longer explain away the financial bonuses tied to juvenile arrests. Nor could he deny his late-night emails encouraging his officers to keep the numbers up. His defense that it was about crime prevention shattered when prosecutors showed the arrest patterns, revealing the stark racial disparities. 75% of juvenile arrests in his district were black teens, despite the area's population being less than 40% black. Hayes fared no better. His voice shook as the prosecution played back recordings of him laughing with Crawford about the body count in their patrol zones. "Better us send them to the morgue early than let them grow up to terrorize our streets," Hayes had said. The words hung in the air, poisonous and unforgettable. And yet, the most powerful testimony didn't come from the officers, but from the survivors. Teen after teen took the stand. Marcus Johnson, now 19, described being arrested at 14 for aggressive eye contact while waiting outside a library. Destiny Parker, a college freshman, spoke to tears about how she was forced to plead guilty to disorderly conduct after being accused of walking with intent to intimidate on her way to church. These weren't hardened criminals. These were kids, arrested for the crime of living while black. When Kesha Williams finally spoke, the courtroom fell still. She sat upright, her voice small but clear. The same dignity she carried in the courtroom that first day, now magnified tenfold. "I was told to lower my gaze. I was told that if I didn't, I was dangerous. But I knew, in that moment, if I lowered my eyes, I'd be saying I was guilty. And I'm not. I never was." She looked directly at the jury, her gaze steady. No child should ever have to apologize for existing. There was a pause, then a ripple of emotion across the courtroom. Some wiped their eyes, others bowed their heads, and in that moment, it became clear. This trial wasn't just about punishment. It was about truth. It was about reclaiming humanity, stolen by a system that called itself justice. Finally, after weeks of testimony, the jury returned. The verdicts came swiftly. Ryan Crawford, guilty on all counts. Civil rights violations, second-degree murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. Captain Morrison, guilty, conspiracy, falsifying public records, civil rights violations. Hayes, guilty, civil rights violations, obstruction, accessory after the fact. When the sentences were read aloud, the courtroom held its collective breath. Crawford, life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Morrison, 45 years. Hayes, 32 years. The sentences sent a message far beyond the walls of that courtroom. The era of silence was over. Long after the sentences were handed down, long after the cameras had been packed away, and the news vans had left the courthouse steps, something deeper began to shift. Not just in Riverside County, but in communities across the country where similar wounds had festered in silence. It started with one announcement: the Riverside County Police Department would be placed under immediate federal oversight. A consent decree was issued, stripping the department of its self-policing powers. The East Side Precinct, once a breeding ground for systemic abuse, was gutted from the top down. Every officer with ties to Crawford's methods was suspended, investigated, or removed entirely. A new interim police chief was sworn in, not from within the department, but from a civilian oversight board. Her first order of business was clear: accountability, transparency, and truth. But the most meaningful reforms didn't begin with policy. They began with people. Community members, once afraid to speak, were invited into reform commissions. Mothers, students, business owners, church leaders. They were no longer treated as outsiders to the justice process. They were now architects of its future. One of the first meetings was held in the same community center where Malik Thompson had once tutored younger kids. This time it was packed wall to wall, not with police, but with families. Kesha Williams sat on the panel, her honor roll pin still proudly displayed, but now joined by something heavier: experience, strength. She spoke plainly. If you're going to serve our neighborhoods, you need to understand our kids. You need to see them as children, not suspects. A young officer in the crowd raised his hand nervously. How do we change that? Kesha didn't hesitate. Start by listening, and stop treating fear as a reason to pull a trigger. Across the county, Training manuals were rewritten. Gone were the compliances and violence checks. In their place, de-escalation, implicit bias training, community immersion programs, trauma-informed practices. New cadets were paired with mentors from the neighborhoods they'd serve, not just for cultural familiarity, but for perspective. No more police or narratives, no more us versus a. Judge Mitchell, still presiding over her courtroom, became more than a judge. She became a symbol of how the law could be wielded, not just to punish, but to protect. She was invited to speak at universities, legal forums, and national summits on judicial ethics and accountability, but she declined most of them. Her reason was always the same. The real work is still here, in this courtroom, in these children's lives. That's where I belong. And she did belong. Families who once feared the courtroom began to find hope in it. Children who had once been dragged into her chambers in handcuffs now returned as speakers, volunteers, advocates. Eleanor Thompson, too, found a new calling. She created a foundation in Malik's name, offering legal aid to families navigating the juvenile justice system. Within its first year, the foundation had already helped expunge over 200 juvenile records tied to false arrests. And everywhere she went, she carried one photo. Malik, smiling in his grocery store uniform, name tag crooked, eyes bright with a future that once felt stolen. But not forgotten. Not anymore. The courthouse was quiet again, not because the struggle was over, but because a different kind of peace had settled into its stone walls. The storm had passed, leaving behind the steady hum of work unfinished, but finally headed in the right direction. Judge Diane Mitchell returned to her chambers that afternoon alone. She walked past the reporters still waiting outside, their cameras lowered, their questions paused. She didn't stop to speak to them. She had never done this for the headlines. Inside her office, the blinds were partly open, letting in the late afternoon light. On the far corner of her desk, beside the well-worn law books and stacks of case files, sat a single photograph. Malik Thompson, smiling in his grocery store uniform, his name tag slightly crooked, his eyes bright with the kind of hope no police report could erase. Mitchell paused, her fingers resting lightly against the frame. This was why she stayed. She had been offered a seat on the state appellate court. She had been invited to speak at national conferences on criminal justice reform. People called her a hero, a trailblazer, a symbol. But she didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be present. Right here, in this small courtroom where kids like Malik and Kesha had been dragged in wearing orange jumpsuits instead of school uniforms, where the fight wasn't glamorous or televised, but where it mattered most. She sat down at her desk, opened the next case file, and prepared for tomorrow. There would always be another child, another family, another battle against a system too willing to see vulnerability as weakness and strength as a threat. But now, at least, those battles wouldn't be fought in silence. Downstairs, in the same courtroom where she had been assaulted and where Crawford's lies had unraveled, a new kind of justice was unfolding. Lawyers argued motions on behalf of kids who, months ago, would have never stood a chance. Public defenders, once drowned out by systemic inertia, now had a fighting shot. It was slow work, painstaking work, but it was hers. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to leave the fight unfinished. Months later, under a warm spring sky, the Riverside County High School auditorium was packed with families, teachers, and students waiting for the graduation ceremony to begin. Among the sea of caps and gowns, Kesha Williams stood tall, the gold valedictorian sash draped across her shoulders like quiet armor. No one could have imagined this day, not after what she endured, but here she was, stepping to the podium with grace that her story had tried to steal from her. She took a slow breath and began. "There was a time," Kesha said, her voice clear but steady with emotion, when I believed that staying quiet was the safest thing I could do, that lowering my eyes would protect me. But I've learned that silence never protected anyone. It only protected those who hurt us. The auditorium fell silent, hanging on her every word. I was told I was a threat because I dared to look someone in the eye. But today I stand here as your valedictorian because I refuse to look away from the truth, and because people like Judge Mitchell reminded me that we do not have to be what they call us. Her classmates wiped their eyes. Parents stood quietly in the back, some remembering their own silent fears. And Judge Mitchell, seated quietly among the faculty, felt tears gather in her eyes. Kesha smiled gently and continued, "I will study law at Howard University because I want to fight for kids who look like me, who are treated like threats before they ever get a chance to speak. I want to make sure the next Malik Thompson is protected, not buried." There was a long pause, and then the entire room stood and applauded, not just for her achievements, but for her courage. Elsewhere in the city, another voice was rising. Eleanor Thompson had transformed her grief into action. She founded the Malik Thompson Foundation for Justice, an organization dedicated to helping families navigate the criminal justice system and fight for accountability in police misconduct cases. Her office, small but busy, became a beacon for mothers and fathers who felt helpless against the machinery of injustice. She met with families late into the night, helped organize community watch groups, and coordinated pro bono legal aid for those who couldn't afford representation. When asked by a reporter how she found the strength, she smiled softly. "I carry Malik with me," she said, touching the locket around her neck. "But I also carry the voices of every child still out there, waiting for someone to see them as more than a problem to be solved." The work was exhausting, but necessary, and slowly it made a difference. Police training academies in Riverside County restructured their curriculum, introducing courses on constitutional rights, implicit bias, and community engagement. Officers were required to spend time in the neighborhoods they patrolled, not as enforcers, but as neighbors. Community review boards were formed, staffed by citizens from all walks of life, with real power to hold law enforcement accountable. No longer were internal investigations allowed to disappear into filing cabinets. Every incident was documented, reviewed, and, when necessary, prosecuted. The change was not perfect, but it was real. And perhaps most importantly, it was led by those who had suffered the most, not by those who had inflicted the harm. On the courthouse lawn, where protesters had once gathered, with tear-streaked faces and trembling signs, a new landmark now stood. A quiet garden, carefully tended by local volunteers, where roses bloomed beside a marble plaque. The words engraved there were simple but unshakable. "In memory of Malik Thompson and all who were silenced too soon, may we never forget their names." Children played nearby, their laughter carried by the breeze. Teachers led school tours past the garden, using Malik's story not as a tale of tragedy alone, but as a lesson in resilience. And every week, Judge Mitchell would walk those steps, not because she had to, but because it reminded her why she stayed. She would pause in front of the memorial, her hand resting gently against the stone, and remember the faces that once filled her courtroom, frightened, defiant, hopeful faces. It reminded her of the truth she carried every day, that justice was not found in grand speeches or distant courts, but in the quiet choices made by ordinary people who refused to let cruelty go unanswered. On one quiet afternoon, she sat alone on a bench nearby, watching as families left the courthouse together, not in fear, but in hope. And for the first time in years, the steps didn't feel cold. They felt reclaimed. Inside her chambers, Malik's photo still sat on her desk. Beside it, a handwritten note from Kesha Williams. "Thank you for seeing me." The weight of it settled softly in her chest. For all the noise, all the fury of the past months, it was this quiet acknowledgement that carried the most power. and so she stayed. When others moved on to higher courts or sought safer roles, she remained where the work was unfinished, in the courtroom where kids still needed protection, in the city still learning how to heal. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to break. And sometimes simply standing your ground becomes the act that changes everything. As the sun set behind the courthouse dome, casting long shadows across the memorial garden, Judge Mitchell gathered her files for the next day's cases. The battle for justice was not over, but, for the first time, it felt like the people who mattered most were finally writing the story. And this time, it wouldn't be erased.